When I was 22, I found myself standing on the precipice of adulthood, eager to embark on a new chapter of my life. The bright lights of New York City beckoned, offering the promise of endless opportunities. I had just landed my first job in the city and was living in Jersey, but the reality of the daily commute quickly became overwhelming. The idea of spending hours in traffic or on a crowded train just to get to work was unbearable. I knew something had to change, and moving to the city was the only logical solution. The problem, however, was money. At that point, I didn't have a lot of it. Like most young people starting out, I was working with a tight budget. I didn't have the luxury of high-end apartments or the ability to pay for something with a prime location. But I was determined. So, when I came across an ad on Craigslist for a bedroom in a Hell's Kitchen apartment at a surprisingly low price, I couldn't resist. It seemed almost too good to be true, but I was desperate, so I called the number listed and set up a time to see the place. The next day, I made my way to Manhattan, heart racing with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Hell's Kitchen had a reputation, but it was also known for being affordable and close to work, which made it perfect for someone like me who was just starting out. I arrived at the building, a nondescript brownstone nestled between more polished buildings, and rang the bell. The landlord, a man in his mid-40s, answered the door. His appearance was disheveled, and his demeanor was strangely cold, as if he had been waiting for me, but didn't quite know how to interact with a potential tenant. There was an awkward silence before he gestured for me to come in. As I entered the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The place was small, but it was clean enough, and the bedroom I'd be renting was more than decent for the price. The landlord gave me a quick tour of the apartment, but his behavior was strange. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, and his eyes darted around as if he was unsure of what to say next. Still, I didn't think much of it. He was the landlord, after all. Maybe this was just how people in New York were, distant and uninterested in pleasantries. After all, I was here for the room, not to make friends. Then came the bombshell. He casually mentioned that I'd have a roommate. His name was Bryn, and the landlord assured me that Bryn was a very quiet, reclusive person, one who kept to himself. In fact, he said, it was a good thing that Bryn was so private because it meant I wouldn't have to deal with any of the usual roommate drama. The landlord knocked on Bryn's door, asking if he'd like to come out and say hello. There was no answer. After a few moments of silence, the landlord shrugged and suggested that Bryn might be napping. "Don't worry about it," he said. "You'll meet him eventually." We moved on to the living room, where I told him I was interested in renting the room. I signed the application without much thought, eager to lock in a place to live, and the next day, the landlord called me to offer the room. He gave me a move-in date, and I couldn't believe my luck. But what happened next was anything but lucky. I moved into the apartment the following week, and my father helped me unload my things. The whole time, Bryn never came out of his room. We could hear him moving around inside, but he didn't even acknowledge us. I assumed he was just the type of person who preferred his privacy, but as I stood there unpacking my things, I couldn't shake the odd feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just Bryn's silence. It was the way the landlord had brushed off his absence as if it were perfectly normal. When my dad left and I was officially alone in the apartment, I decided to settle in and watch some Netflix on my laptop. That's when I heard it, the soft click of a door opening and closing. My heart skipped a beat. I knew this was my chance to finally meet Bryn. I got out of bed, walked toward my bedroom door, and cautiously opened it. But before I could take a single step into the living room, I heard the front door of the apartment slam shut. I froze. The sound was jarring, and for a brief moment, everything went completely still. I walked out into the living room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. No one was there. The apartment felt eerily quiet. I had no idea what was going on. Bryn was supposed to be my roommate, yet I hadn't even seen him once. Was he avoiding me on purpose? Or was there something else going on? The next night, I lay in bed trying to sleep when I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. They were coming from Bryn's room. The floorboards creaked, and the sound of movement outside my door made my pulse race. I sat up, heart pounding, and peered through the crack under my door. I could see the faint outline of feet just beyond the threshold. The footsteps stopped. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door and confront him? Or should I wait for him to leave? My mind raced, but I did nothing. I simply held my breath and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and I heard Bryn's door close softly behind him. The following days were a blur of restless nights and strange noises. Every time I tried to get some sleep, I would hear thumps coming from Bryn's room. It sounded like he was moving furniture, or maybe just pacing. It didn't make sense. How could someone be so active at all hours of the night without ever interacting with the people they lived with? I was tempted to knock on his door and ask him to keep it down, but I hadn't even met the guy yet. For all I knew, he could be dangerous, or at the very least, a complete weirdo. So I stayed in my room, trying to ignore the sounds that made my skin crawl. Eventually, one day, I came back from shopping for groceries, exhausted from the long day. I dropped my bags on the couch in the living room and decided to relax for a bit. I was watching Netflix when I noticed Bryn's door was slightly ajar, the light inside still on. This was it. This was my chance to finally meet him, to see if I could make sense of all the strange behavior. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed the door open. The room was completely empty. Not a single piece of furniture except for a single chair in the corner. My stomach dropped. The chair was an old wooden desk chair, the kind you'd find in a high school classroom. But what struck me most was the emptiness of the room, the absence of any personal belongings, any sign that someone had lived there. It was like Bryn had never existed at all. I turned off the light and shut the door behind me, my hands shaking. This couldn't be real. Was I going insane? Had I imagined everything? The footsteps, the noises, the feeling of being watched? But no, this was too strange, too unsettling. I rushed back to my room and locked the door. My heart was racing, my head spinning. I pulled out my phone and called the landlord, hoping for an explanation. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. But then I heard something, a faint, persistent ringing sound coming from my closet. I froze. The phone had only rung twice, which meant the landlord had to have declined the call. My stomach turned. The sick realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The landlord was in my closet. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I locked myself in the bathroom and waited for the police to arrive. It felt like an eternity before they finally showed up. They searched the apartment with me, but the most horrifying discovery came when they found the landlord hiding under my bed. The police arrested him, but when they began investigating further, it became clear that this man wasn't a legitimate landlord. He didn't even own the apartment. He had been running a scam. There was no lease, no contract. It was all a lie. As it turned out, the man had somehow managed to get his hands on a set of keys to the apartment and was living there under the guise of being the landlord, while simultaneously taking advantage of young, unsuspecting tenants like me. In the end, I was able to move out with the help of my dad, but the experience left me shaken. I learned to trust my instincts and, more importantly, to be cautious when it came to trusting strangers. What had started as a simple Craigslist search for an affordable place to live had turned into a nightmare that I couldn't escape fast enough. In the weeks that followed, I wondered how many other people had fallen victim to the same man, the same scam. The experience left me paranoid, constantly questioning the people around me, wondering who I could trust and who was hiding something just below the surface. Hell's Kitchen may have seemed like the perfect place to start fresh, but it taught me a harsh lesson about trust, deception, and the unsettling truth that sometimes the people you least expect can be hiding the darkest secrets. I had never really thought about how much a change of environment could affect a person's sense of safety until I moved into the house with Ben. It was a small town, a quiet place, far removed from the hustle and bustle of the city. I had just started working at a local chicken farm, and the apartment I found was the perfect solution to my housing dilemma. It was inexpensive, which was ideal given my limited budget, and it was close to work. The house itself was quaint, modest but functional, and the rent was reasonable. The landlord, Ben, was an older man, probably in his late 70s, with a weathered face that seemed to tell 1,000 stories. He wasn't particularly friendly, but there was nothing overtly alarming about him at first. When I met Ben for the first time, he was polite but distant. He explained that I would be renting a spare room in his house, and though he didn't say much about his own life, there was something in his tone that suggested he had lived a long, solitary existence. He lived alone, which seemed to fit the image of a man his age. The house, though a little worn, had a certain charm to it. Old wooden floors that creaked underfoot, walls lined with yellowed wallpaper, and a heavy, musty smell that filled the air when you first entered. But it didn't bother me. I could tell Ben was a creature of habit, someone who had lived in that house for years, likely with no intention of leaving anytime soon. Our interactions were minimal. I kept to myself, and so did Ben. It wasn't unusual for him to spend hours in his study, which was tucked away at the back of the house, while I kept to my room or spent time in the kitchen. The house was big enough that we didn't run into each other often, and when we did, our conversations were brief. He was quiet, old-fashioned, and in many ways, almost invisible. It was clear he didn't want to be bothered, and I respected that. But there was one thing about Ben that made me uneasy from the start. He always warned me never to go into the basement. The first time he said it, it was casual, almost like a joke. "Stay out of the basement," he told me, his voice gruff but light. "Trust me, you don't want to go down there." I laughed it off, figuring it was just his way of trying to set boundaries, or maybe he was just a little quirky. But then he said it again, and again. It started to feel like a command rather than a friendly suggestion. "Seriously," he said one evening, "don't go into the basement. I've got things down there that are better left alone." I brushed it off, but deep down, his words lingered in my mind like an unanswered question. There was something strange about the way Ben spoke about that basement. It was as if he was hiding something. But at the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just an eccentric old man with his own habits and secrets. I wasn't particularly interested in snooping around his home, and I didn't want to test the waters of his strange warnings. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and as time went on, I found myself thinking more and more about that basement. Ben wasn't home one afternoon when I came back from work, and the house was quiet. I decided to take a chance. There was no harm in looking, right? The door to the basement was old, with peeling paint and a rusted doorknob. It didn't look like it had been opened in years, and the air around it felt still, untouched. But there was something about the door that called to me. Perhaps it was the idea that it was off limits, or maybe it was just my growing suspicion that Ben was hiding something, but the temptation was too much to resist. I turned the doorknob slowly, pushing the door open. The air in the basement was musty, thick with dust, and it carried the scent of something long forgotten. The stairs were steep, the steps creaking under my weight as I descended into the darkness below. At the bottom, I found a light switch and flipped it on. The basement was dimly lit, but enough light filtered through to reveal a stark, unsettling sight. The room was filled with things, boxes stacked haphazardly, old furniture covered in white sheets, and bags strewn across the floor. But it wasn't the clutter that caught my attention. It was the room off to the side, tucked away in the corner, a room I hadn't noticed before. It was small and narrow, with a door that looked far too new compared to the rest of the basement, and it was locked. Something inside me screamed to turn away, but I couldn't. I had to know what was behind that door. I found a crowbar tucked in a nearby corner, probably something Ben had left out of laziness, and pried open the door. The smell hit me first, a rancid, sickly scent that made my stomach turn. It was so overpowering that I nearly vomited right there. But I forced myself to step inside, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. What I saw in that room will haunt me for the rest of my life. The floor was stained, dark patches of what I assumed was blood marking the concrete beneath. Black garbage bags were piled in the corner, some torn open at the edges, revealing what looked like body parts. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, eyes darting around the room. There was a workbench in the corner, covered in tools that looked far too well used, far too grim for any regular home project. I could barely process what I was seeing. My mind was screaming for me to leave, to get out of that room, but I was frozen in place. There was a camera in the corner, aimed down at the workbench, and I couldn't help but notice the blood-stained rags piled on the floor beneath it. It was all wrong. It was all so terribly wrong. This wasn't a basement. It was a crime scene. I took a quick picture with my phone, my hands shaking as I snapped the photo, and I ran out of the basement, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and the world around me seemed to warp as I ascended the stairs, gasping for air. My legs felt weak, and I stumbled as I reached the top, barely able to steady myself against the wall. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. But I knew I couldn't just walk away without telling someone. I grabbed my things, stuffed them into a bag as quickly as I could, and ran for the door. But just as I was about to leave, I heard the front door open. Ben was home. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was terrified he would come upstairs and catch me trying to escape. He didn't know I'd discovered his secret. He didn't know what I had seen. I ducked into the hallway, praying he wouldn't see me. He was already on his way downstairs, oblivious to the fact that his dark, twisted secret had just been uncovered. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as I heard him shuffle toward the basement door. I knew he was going to check on the room, make sure everything was in place. But it was too late. I had seen everything, and I wasn't staying to find out what he would do next. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I went as long as it was far away from that house. I ended up at my brother's farm 15 miles away, where I spent the night in a state of complete shock. I was still trying to process what I had seen, what I had discovered in that basement, when I called the sheriff. The sheriff's department arrived a few hours later, and I went with them to the house to give a statement. They didn't go into much detail about what they found in that basement, but when I saw them walk out of the house with Ben in handcuffs, I knew. He was arrested for what he had been doing down there. I later found out that the bags were indeed filled with human remains, and the workbench had been used for some of the most horrific things I could ever imagine. Ben had been living his twisted double life, hiding in plain sight, and I had been the one to stumble upon it. I was lucky to have escaped when I did. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the image of the blood-stained basement, the camera, and the bags. It was all too real, too horrifying to be a nightmare. When I told my brother about everything, he was furious. He couldn't believe that I had stayed in that house for as long as I had. But at the time, I didn't know. I didn't know what Ben was capable of. I didn't know the monster lurking behind that old, weathered face. I'll never forget that basement. I'll never forget the feeling of being in the presence of evil, of being so close to something so dark, so twisted. It was a lesson learned the hard way. Trust no one and always listen to your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. And sometimes the people you think are the most harmless can hide the most sinister secrets. My first year of college was supposed to be an exciting new chapter in my life, one filled with fresh experiences, new friendships, and a sense of independence. I had high hopes for my dormitory experience, eager to meet people from all walks of life, ready to form lifelong connections. The day I moved in, I was full of anticipation. I had everything in place, my books, clothes, and personal items scattered across my new room. It was a fresh start in every sense of the word, and I couldn't wait to dive in. As I unpacked, I met my roommate, John. He was a tall, slightly disheveled guy with fair skin, black hair, and glasses that sat awkwardly on his nose. He looked like someone who spent most of his time indoors, probably glued to a computer screen or playing video games. His voice had a faint, almost delicate tone to it that didn't quite match his appearance. His handshake was limp, what people often call a dead fish handshake. It made me immediately uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I tried to brush it off, thinking that maybe I was just nervous about this new living situation. He didn't seem like a bad person. In fact, he barely spoke. But there was something off about him, something that lingered just beneath the surface. That night, I went out to meet some of the other students on my floor. I quickly connected with a few people, and it was clear to me that John wasn't the type I'd naturally gravitate towards. He didn't seem to have much to say, and when I did try to talk to him, His answers were always short, awkward, and uninterested. By the time night fell, I was back in my room, hoping to settle in and get some rest. I figured I'd make some small talk with John the next day, get to know him a little better. But as I lay in bed, I found myself feeling unsettled by the silence in the room. It wasn't just the lack of conversation between us. It was something about John himself that felt out of place. John went to bed early that night, as I expected. He turned off his lamp around 10 p.m., and the room fell silent. I was left alone with my thoughts, trying to adjust to my new environment. I plugged in my headphones and watched some videos on my phone to pass the time. It was already past midnight when I finally decided to turn in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The room felt oddly oppressive, as if it was suffocating me. I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone in my thoughts. I had just rolled over to my side when I noticed it. The sound of faint flashes. I was too comfortable, too lazy to get up and check, assuming it was nothing. I kept my eyes closed, hoping the sound would stop so I could fall asleep. But it didn't. The flashes continued, sharp and rhythmic, cutting through the darkness like an insistent, unwanted reminder. I finally forced myself to open my eyes. What I saw made my blood run cold. John was sitting up in his bed, holding his phone in his hand. His face was illuminated by the eerie light from the screen, and his eyes were fixed intently on me. I watched in horror as he snapped a picture of me. The light from his phone flashed, blinding me momentarily. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned away, pretending to be asleep. I didn't know how to react. Was this a mistake? Did he not realize how invasive this was? Or worse, did he know exactly what he was doing? I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath, praying he wouldn't do anything else. The flashes stopped, but my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Why was he doing this? What was his intention? I had heard of people using their phones in the dark, but this was different. The way he was watching me, was it curiosity or something darker? It didn't feel like something innocent. I could feel his eyes on me, even as I tried to shut my own. The next morning, I woke up to find my backpack slightly ajar. It wasn't much, but it was enough to unsettle me. I couldn't remember exactly how I had left it the night before, but something about the way it was positioned made me suspicious. I went through the bag to see if anything was missing. At first glance, everything seemed in place, but as I sifted through the contents, I noticed that it felt lighter. Something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. When John came into the room, I couldn't help but ask, "Did you go through my bag last night?" He looked at me, his face blank, before responding with a tone that seemed far too defensive for someone who was innocent. "No," he said, almost too quickly. "I didn't touch your stuff." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying the lie. I wanted to press him further, to ask more questions, but I didn't. I couldn't prove anything, and I wasn't even sure what exactly I was accusing him of. So, I let it go, though the feeling of unease settled deeper in my chest. The days that followed were an unsettling mix of strange behaviors and off-putting encounters. John continued to keep to himself, retreating into his corner of the room, but I started to notice things that made me more and more uncomfortable. He would sit up at odd hours in the night, staring at his screen, never speaking to me unless it was absolutely necessary. And every time I came back to the room after being out, my things seemed subtly shifted. My books were out of place, my clothes looked like they'd been touched. Small things, insignificant on their own, but together they formed a pattern that I couldn't ignore. I decided that I wouldn't confront him again. I couldn't be sure that he was actually doing anything wrong, and I didn't want to start drama over something I couldn't prove. But the feeling of being watched, the sense that I was being invaded, continued to grow. It was more than just the occasional strange behavior. It was the unsettling, constant presence of someone who seemed to be hiding something, someone who didn't belong in the space we shared, someone who had crossed boundaries without even acknowledging them. One night, I decided I had to figure out what was going on. I stayed up later than usual, determined to stay awake and observe John. I had no clear plan, no idea what I was hoping to discover. I just knew that I needed answers. Around 1 or 2 a.m., after the sounds of the storm had died down, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Through the corner of my eye, I saw John sitting upright in his bed, his phone held in front of him. He was looking at something or someone. As I pretended to sleep, I felt the weight of his gaze on me again. Then I heard it, a soft, barely audible exhale right above my head. The bed creaked as John slowly got up and stood by my bedside, his presence just inches away from me. My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, to confront him, but I couldn't move. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I stayed perfectly still, praying he would leave, hoping that somehow he hadn't noticed I was awake. The seconds felt like hours, and every part of me screamed for him to just go back to his bed. Finally, he retreated, the sound of the mattress spring shifting once more as he returned to his own bed. The room was eerily quiet again, and I lay there, frozen, until morning light broke through the window. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, when I returned to the room, I found John's laptop open on his bed. The lid was slightly ajar, and something told me that this time I had to take a look. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the strange behavior, the unease that had been building for days, but I had to know. I opened the laptop, not expecting what I would find. John's desktop was a mess. There were folders everywhere, files scattered in disarray, but it wasn't the disorganization that caught my attention. It was the pictures. I started opening the files, and my heart sank as I saw image after image of me. Pictures of me in bed, taken at night, with the flash from an iPhone lighting up my face. The flash was unmistakable. He had been taking photos of me while I slept. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the images. There were more, shots of my duffel bag, the inside of my backpack. It was as if he had been cataloging my every move, capturing moments when I thought I was alone, moments when I was at my most vulnerable. I couldn't breathe. I had to act. I filmed the screen with my phone, showing the photos he had taken of me, and immediately left the room. I went straight to the dorm office and reported what I had found. I requested a room change, but I knew the damage had already been done. I didn't know what John's motives were, but it was clear to me now that he was dangerous. That night, I stayed with a friend, unable to face my own room after what I had discovered. The next morning, I was moved to a new room across campus. I didn't know what happened to John after that, whether he was disciplined or kicked out of the dorm. But what I did know was that I would never forget the eerie feeling of being watched. The creepiness of John wasn't just in his actions, it was in the subtle way he invaded my space, my privacy, and my trust. Looking back, I realized that John's behavior was a red flag, a sign that I should have trusted my instincts from the start. He wasn't just a quirky, socially awkward roommate. He was someone who was crossing boundaries in ways I didn't understand until it was too late. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it felt like to be the subject of someone's obsessive, invasive gaze. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought it would be the fresh start I had been yearning for. After spending years at home with my family, dealing with the frustrations and limitations that came with living under someone else's roof, the idea of having my own space felt like a promise of freedom and independence. It wasn't the most glamorous place, a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, sublet by my dad's friend, Kathy. Kathy was kind enough to offer me a good deal on the rent, but there was a catch. I would be sharing the space with an older woman, Betty, who Kathy had also taken in due to financial struggles. It didn't seem like a big deal at first. Kathy had assured me that Betty was a nice lady, just a little older and a bit quirky. I figured it was just a small inconvenience, nothing that would get in the way of my independence. At first, everything seemed fine. Betty was polite, if not a bit reserved. She was in her late 60s, with long, graying hair that she always tied in a messy bun. She didn't have a lot of energy and spent most of her time in her room, watching TV or knitting. There was nothing overtly alarming about her. She had lived in the apartment for a while, and it seemed like her life revolved around simple routines. We had a couple of casual conversations about life, and she was always very polite, if a little distant. But there was an undercurrent, a sense that something was off, that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first strange occurrence happened just a few days after I moved in. I had been watching TV in the living room one evening, when I noticed Betty standing in the hallway. Her face appeared around the corner, peeking out from behind the wall, her eyes locked on me. She didn't say anything at first. She just stared. I wasn't sure if it was a moment of confusion or if she had simply forgotten what she was doing, but it felt unsettling. I tried to wave, to acknowledge her presence, but there was no response. Then, without a word, she disappeared back into the hallway. I didn't know what to make of it at the time. People have weird moments sometimes, especially when they're older. Maybe she was just tired, or maybe she'd been lost in thought. But it stuck with me. I decided to let it slide, thinking it was just one of those odd quirks that came with living with someone else, especially someone older. The next morning, I ran into Kathy in the kitchen. She was cooking breakfast, and I tried to brush off the awkward moment with Betty the night before, asking if there was something I should know about her behavior. Kathy looked at me with mild surprise. "Betty's always been a little strange, but nothing to worry about," she said. "She's just getting older. I don't think she has any problems, though." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the days went on, more strange things began to happen. I would come home after work to find Betty sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, but her eyes wouldn't follow the screen. She would sit there for hours, as if she were completely detached from reality, yet not asleep, not engaged. I found myself feeling increasingly uncomfortable around her, like I was walking on eggshells, unsure of how to interact. But the real turning point came one night, a night I will never forget. It was a few weeks into living with Betty when the first signs of something far more disturbing began to emerge. I was in my room, laptop open in front of me, when I heard the distinct sound of knocking, soft at first, then growing louder. It came from the other side of my bedroom door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I got up, confused, and opened the door cautiously. There was Betty, standing in the hallway, her back slightly hunched, her hands clasped together in front of her. She was looking at me with wide, unfocused eyes, and the strange, faint noises escaped from her lips. At first, I thought she might be sick, or maybe having some kind of episode. "Betty?" I called out, my voice unsure. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. She just continued to make those strange, guttural noises, something between a moan and a hum. I took a small step back, unsure of what to do. Her expression was blank, distant, like she wasn't really seeing me, but more like she was staring through me. It was as if she wasn't there at all. I didn't know whether to call Kathy or to just let Betty be. But then she did something that pushed me past my discomfort into full-blown concern. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling, and placed her hand on the doorframe. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and there was something almost predatory in her gaze, something that unnerved me to my core. "Stay out of the basement," she muttered in a hoarse voice, the words barely audible. I froze. The basement. Ben, the landlord from a few years ago, had warned me about the basement of his house. But Betty? She wasn't even making sense now. "Betty?" I said, my voice shaking. "What do you mean? Are you all right?" But before I could ask more, she just turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. I stood there in the doorway, trying to understand what had just happened. Her behavior wasn't normal. It was almost as if she had no control over it. It felt as though something inside her had snapped, and now she was lost to some world of her own. A world where reality didn't exist in the way it did for the rest of us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her words. "Stay out of the basement." What basement? I didn't even know there was a basement in the apartment. The building was old, but I had never been down there. Maybe it was a small crawl space, or maybe Betty was just confused. But something about her words, the way she had said them, stuck with me. There was a sense of urgency, of fear, that sent a shiver down my spine. The next day, I went to Kathy and told her about the incident. Kathy's face turned pale when I described Betty's behavior. "She's never acted like that before," Kathy said, clearly concerned. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea she was like this." I tried to brush it off, but deep down, I knew something had changed in Betty. I knew her strange behavior wasn't just a matter of age or eccentricity. There was something much darker at play. The following nights were the worst. Betty's odd behavior escalated. Every night, she would knock on my door, make those strange noises, and occasionally she would stand in the doorway, just staring at me, unblinking, her eyes wide and glassy. I couldn't take it anymore. The tension was unbearable. I felt like I was being slowly suffocated by her presence, by the oppressive feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't long before I began to notice more signs of Betty's decline. The constant knocking became louder, more frantic. The sounds at night, groaning, mumbling, whispering, became a regular occurrence. And one evening, when I was in the living room, I heard a faint creak in the floorboards behind me. When I turned around, Betty was standing in the doorway, holding something in her hand. It was a knife. I gasped, my heart racing, and took a step back. Betty's hair was wild, her clothes disheveled, and her face was twisted in a grotesque mask of confusion and fear. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, and she muttered again, this time incoherently. She didn't seem to recognize me at all. She didn't seem to recognize anything. The knife was held loosely in her trembling hand, but she didn't move toward me. She just stood there, breathing heavily, as if she was unsure of what to do next. I didn't know what to do. Should I try to reason with her? Should I call the police? But something told me I shouldn't approach her. I couldn't take the risk. I backed out of the room slowly, keeping my eyes on her the whole time, and shut my bedroom door behind me, locking it quickly. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone. I called Kathy, but she didn't answer. I tried again, and this time, she picked up. Kathy, I don't know what's happening, but Betty, she's not herself. She's acting erratically, and she has a knife. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Kathy finally spoke, her voice shaky. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. It sounds like Betty might be suffering from sundowning syndrome. It's a condition that affects older people, especially those with dementia, where they get confused and agitated in the evening. They can become aggressive, paranoid, or delusional. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Betty wasn't just being quirky or eccentric. She was struggling with something far more serious. The confusion, the aggression, the strange behavior, all of it made sense now. She wasn't just a bizarre old woman. She was sick, and I had been living with her in the midst of her mental decline. Kathy was able to arrange for Betty to be seen by a doctor, and soon after, Betty was placed in a care facility. Kathy apologized profusely, and I left the apartment shortly after, unable to live in a space that had become a source of such fear and anxiety. It took me months to shake the feeling of being watched, the memory of Betty's unblinking gaze, and the echo of her strange, guttural noises. Living with her had been a nightmare, not because of any malice, but because she had become a person I could no longer recognize. The woman I had shared a space with was no longer there. What remained was something that looked like her, but wasn't, lost in the grip of a disease that tore away everything she had once been. The experience taught me a hard lesson about the fragility of the human mind and the heartbreaking nature of diseases like dementia. It also taught me the value of compassion and understanding, especially when it comes to people who are suffering, even when their behavior becomes difficult to understand. Living with Betty was terrifying, but it was also an education in the complexities of mental health, a subject I hadn't truly understood until it was staring me in the face. The basement may have been a metaphor for the darkness that enveloped her mind, a place where she wandered, lost, and confused. And though I had been terrified, I now see that Betty wasn't the one to fear. She was a victim of something far more insidious, something that took her away from the world I had known her in. Throughout the course of these stories, the protagonist experiences a series of deeply unsettling encounters with strangers, roommates, and landlords, each of whom hides something disturbing beneath the surface. From the mysterious landlord in Hell's Kitchen, who isn't who he claims to be, to the frightening basement secrets uncovered by Ben, to the invasive and obsessive behavior of John, and finally, the heartbreaking decline of Betty's mental state. Each tale reveals a profound sense of unease and distrust that shapes the protagonist's journey. These experiences leave lasting emotional scars, highlighting the vulnerability we all face when navigating unfamiliar spaces and relationships. Despite the terrifying circumstances, the protagonist learns the importance of trusting instincts, recognizing red flags, and understanding that not all is as it seems, especially when living with others or in a shared environment. The key lesson here is the necessity of vigilance and self-awareness in our daily interactions, especially when it comes to our living situations and the people we share spaces with. It is essential to trust our gut feelings, speak up when things feel off, and ensure we are not allowing ourselves to become too comfortable in situations that could be dangerous. Applying these lessons in our lives today can help protect our mental, emotional, and physical well-being. If you found this story gripping, please consider subscribing to the channel to support our efforts. Your subscription encourages us to continue creating more captivating and insightful content for you to enjoy. Thank you for your support, and we look forward to bringing you more exciting stories in the future.